Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this year's first presentation of our Harnessing Technology for the Social Good series. This is our second year of sponsoring this series, which we initiated in our school to bring greater attention to innovative research and practice efforts in using technology to improve services for and the well-being of vulnerable populations. We hope to use this series to highlight and bring broader recognition to this growing but often underappreciated area of our field, and also to help build connections and networks among researchers and practitioners who have mutual interest. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Janae Beer from the University of Georgia as this year's inaugural speaker. As our selection committee reviewed the profiles of many speakers, we found that Dr. Beer's work exemplified the qualities we are seeking to promote through this series. Dr. Beer is a faculty member in the Institute of Gerontology at the University of Georgia and holds dual appointments in the College of Public Health and the School of Social Work. She's an engineering psychologist by training with an interdisciplinary background and experience in usability, technology design, psychology, and gerontology. So as you can see, she brings an unusual breadth of experience to her research agenda. Her research program features a mix of social science and technology implementation to investigate technology applications that promote health and well-being for older adults, particularly those with or at risk of dementia. Dr. Beer studies how technologies designed to help such persons must be usable, accepted, and readily adopted by the older population. As such, her research focuses on human-robot interaction, telehealth, and technology acceptance and adoption. She's evaluated technology supports and interventions ranging from web applications to advanced robotics. Based on her extensive work in this area, she also now serves as the co-director of the Cognitive Aging Research and Education Center, an interdisciplinary hub designed for dementia diagnosis, telecare, clinical research, and education for rural Georgians. We're excited to learn more about her research today. Please join me in virtually welcoming Dr. Janae Beer.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for logging in. I know it's been a crazy week, and I really appreciate you taking the time to listen and giving me an opportunity to share some very recent data that we've collected. So today I'm going to present opportunities and challenges of designing socially assistive robots for persons with dementia. Thank you for the introduction, and as mentioned, I'm assistant professor here at the Institute of Gerontology. I have a really unique joint appointment, but I'm neither a public health professional or a social worker. My background is in engineering psychology. I was actually trained at Georgia Tech under Dr. Wendy Rogers, who is now at your school. So I have a picture here of my grandma. This is Grandma June. She was diagnosed with dementia when I was a teenager. And I think for a lot of us, research is me-search, right? Driven by your own personal experiences. And certainly my grandma drives my passion for this research. Is it forwarding? There we go. I'm the co-director of the Cognitive Aging Research and Education Center. And as the introduction mentioned, this is a hub for a lot of different initiatives. Everything from telecognitive assessment with a particular focus on rural populations throughout Georgia. We have biofactor capability. We do a lot with robot social engagement, dementia education outreach, and technology-supported support care. I'm going to talk today primarily about robot-led cognitive training. This has been a growing area of research for our center, and I have some data just recently collected that I'll share with you today. As many of you know, our population is aging, right? So this is data from 2014, and the countries that are shown in the red and orange colors show populations that have a larger percentage of older adults, 20% or higher. And you can see that come 2050, the number of countries that are experiencing a growth in the aging population tremendously increases. When polled about their greatest health fears, an overwhelming number of older adults indicate that what they fear most is losing their memory. And these fears are not unfounded, as Alzheimer's and related dementias are certainly correlated with age. There's actually lots of different types of neurodegenerative diseases, but 70% of these diseases fall into the bucket of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, ADRD. Alzheimer's disease is just one type of dementia. There are many types, for example, Lewy body disease, Parkinson's, Huntington's, ALS, and there are differences in pathophysiology across these different dementias. ADRD does affect many older people, but I want to stress that it is not a normal part of aging. Normally, or I should say, unfortunately, we're not close to a cure. And it's estimated by the World Health Organization that around 50 million people worldwide have some form of dementia. So the brain is the seat of behavior. And cognition is what the brain does, right? So the physical changes to the brain caused by ADRD can cause dramatic functional changes, deterioration in memory, thinking, behavior, and the ability to perform everyday tasks. So when we talk about Alzheimer's disease, it's often discussed in terms of stages. So this table was published in 2006 and is actually one of my favorite depictions of the behavioral stages of dementia, ranging from mild cognitive impairment, known as MCI, to severe Alzheimer's disease. This table is from 2006. It does a nice job, but I do want to note that people are now living longer and longer with the disease than when this table was originally published. And in part, that's because we're better at earlier diagnosis, and we're also better at managing symptoms and safety. What I want to point you to is actually the first stage, MCI, mild cognitive impairment. And there's some debate among researchers. Some folks posit that MCI is actually part of the disease process, but others argue that it's actually a separate issue. So consider this, only 15% of people who exhibit MCI will actually convert to mild Alzheimer's within a year period. And some people actually live their entire older adulthood with MCI, not converting over to Alzheimer's at all. However, on the other side of the coin, 84% of people with Alzheimer's disease started with MCI at some point. So whatever the debate and definition, MCI is a good place to start when we're talking about cognitive training, which I'm going to get into here in a minute. Folks with MCI do experience isolated deficits and memory impairment, but they're still capable of engaging in very complex tasks. So they have a lot to gain from cognitive training. So cognitive training has been shown to be effective in secondary prevention. So in other words, preventing the conversion of MCI into dementia. In fact, a recent meta-analysis suggested that cognitive training can actually enhance cognitive function among individuals with MCI. So what is cognitive training exactly? I'm sure many of you have heard the term use it or lose it. And there's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that this is true. Cognitive training is the implementation of guided tasks that are designed to reflect and ultimately improve specific cognitive functions. Cognitive training can be thought of as structured practice. And like most practice aimed at skill building, there are many different types of cognitive training programs and techniques. So there are many examples of cognitive training in a single cognitive domain. For example, memory games can improve memory. If you read books or work on crossword puzzles, that can improve verbal fluency. So the effectiveness of cognitive training in persons with MCI, it actually really depends on how that training is structured. So for example, multi-domain training is thought to provide a greater range of cognitive challenge and increased simulation in cognitive plasticity compared to a single domain training. Other considerations such as the length of the training provided, whether or not it was self-guided in the home or completed in a social setting, all of these different factors impact the success of cognitive training among individuals with MCI. So I mentioned that multi-domain cognitive training is ideal, and what exactly does that mean? Well, tasks that require the whole brain are the most effective in creating meaningful cognitive functional improvements. So particularly if that complex task is novel. So in other words, learn something new later in life. That's the best form of cognitive training. For those of you who might be thinking about retirement, if you're like me and you like to dream about retirement, think about learning a new instrument, learning a new language. Those are the types of really novel tasks that can really drive actual brain change. So musical engagement provides an excellent multimodal task for studying neuroplasticity. So think about it. To learn an instrument, participants, you have to integrate sensory processing. You are learning musical language, translating notes into meaning. There's motor learning, playing the keys. There's affective processing and just a number of cognitive processes. There's a visual component, there's a coding task, there's symbols on the page. It's a fantastic task for this purpose. There's also a social component, and I bring that up because it's incredibly important. You're interacting with the instructor, taking cues from your piano teacher. Those also have cognitive benefits. So in fact, older adults who learned an instrument in childhood, they retain the benefits of that training-induced plasticity into older age. And it's not surprising that engagement in music has been related to a decreased risk in dementia and MCI. 6 months of individualized piano instruction has been associated with improved performances in both executive functioning and working memory. So despite the benefits of cognitive training in the form of learning music, there are many barriers to its widespread implementation. So from a social justice standpoint, this is very important. Traditional methods of music learning typically require an instructor, typically require travel time, the coordination of schedules, a meeting location, not to mention purchasing an instrument. These factors can be difficult to manage, particularly coupled with the fact that training can be very expensive. So music instructors often charge by the hour. So thinking about this from a social justice perspective, older adults in rural or low access settings, and even those with physical disability, chronic medical conditions, unreliable transportation, just lack of access, they have difficulty actually using and accessing traditional music lessons. So innovative methods for delivering multimodal cognitive training are needed. There's a lot of work in this area, particularly looking at technological innovation that over the long term can drive down the cost associated with learning new skills. It's not a perfect solution, right? Technology still costs money. It still requires resources such as access to Wi-Fi. However, these one-time purchases often are cheaper and more accessible than paying instructors over a long time period. Technological assistance has been utilized to facilitate cognitive training as well as rehabilitative interventions using technologies such as virtual reality, interactive video gaming, and mobile devices. A systematic review recently published in 2018 actually found that tech-based cognitive training can improve cognitive function among individuals with MCI. In fact, they reviewed 26 studies and they showed improvements to global cognitive function, attention, executive function, and memory. So there's a lot of potential here. It can also help in terms of reducing feelings of anxiety and depression. Now, those 26 studies that were included in that review did not involve learning music. And I mentioned earlier that learning music is a truly ideal form of multimodal cognitive training. Now, the nature of music learning, specifically piano playing, requires, of course, training, learning to play the music, but it's also a dynamic social interaction and engagement with the instructor. And this can be difficult to replicate in technology without a human teacher. So what about robots? Now, you might be thinking, Janae, we just talked about cost and access, and now you're talking about robots, right? How can people afford this, right? And you're right, this is not, that the cost is something to consider, but I want to stress that the market for robotics is exploding. And the cost of these systems is actually dramatically decreasing each year. And I'll come back to this point a little bit later when I talk about commercialization, and our group is working in this arena. So socially assistive robots might be uniquely suited to provide real-time instruction and feedback as well as social engagement. So socially assistive robots are a form of technology designed to aid individuals in completing tasks. Typically, these robots are autonomous, mobile, interactive, and they've been utilized across many disciplines, including healthcare, education, rehabilitation. And they've been particularly effective with the older adult population, promoting social interactions, education, and tutoring. So you might find it hard to imagine your grandma interacting with a robot, right? And that's fair. It's not the solution for every single older adult. Older adults are a diverse group. It covers 4 decades of a person's life. They're far from homogeneous. And they can vary in their technology acceptance and use. However, I want to stress that older adults do accept and use technology, such as robots, and they might more readily accept this technology than you think. Older adults will and use technology if the benefit of using it is clear. So in fact, much of my prior work, along with my many collaborators, has focused on mixed methods formative evaluation, looking at older adult robot acceptance. And an overwhelming theme across over a decade worth of research shows that older adults and their caregivers are open and willing to use robots for a variety of health and wellness activities. This includes previous work investigating emotionally assistive technologies. That was some of my earliest work, as well as mobile manipulators to assist with instrumental activities of daily living. A lot of telepresence work has also emerged from our laboratory, and this includes applications in the home, as well as assisted living facilities. However, there are many usability and privacy issues to address, especially among older adult usage of the technology and those aging with disability. So some of this work includes collaboration with UIUC. And finally, in the realm of dementia research, there's much work that has been conducted in our laboratory in the past, as well as ongoing, investigating socially assistive robots for caregiver support, as well as in assisted living and cognitive training, which I'll talk more about next. So all of this early work showing that older adults are surprisingly accepting of robots leads to our current pilot study that I'm going to talk about today, where we are developing and evaluating a socially assistive robot cognitive training tutor. To our knowledge, assistive robots have not been applied specifically for the purpose of multimodal music learning. So we do not know of an application where a robot has been specifically used for teaching older adults to play a novel instrument. This work can be done without an extremely interdisciplinary team. This is something I love about this field. This work can never be done alone. I've worked with amazing individuals. I want to give a shout out to Lisa Renzi-Hambin. She's a neuroscience scientist on this particular project. But you can see here, this is a collaboration among gerontologists, roboticists, as well as engineers. So let me start with the goals and the research questions for this pilot study. So we conducted a 4-week pilot study involving robot-led piano lessons with older adults. And I'm going to discuss this pilot study in depth. It was, like I mentioned, a 1-month study with a smaller sample of older adults. And I do want to note those limitations. This is a pilot study. However, this pilot study is extremely novel for several reasons, and that's why I'm excited to share this new data with you. So first, why start with such formative work in human-robot interaction? Well, in human-robot interaction, or HRI, you'll hear me refer it to, we typically start with very small sample sizes, in part because there's just so much extreme effort taken to program and develop the technology. And there's a really rapid pace in which we conduct these design iterations. So lots of quick formative work is typically done early in the development process. This pilot was conducted in preparation for an upcoming groundbreaking clinical trial, which COVID allows. We are ready to start collecting data. We're just kind of waiting for the right time and safety protocols in which to do so. So this experimental setup and the use of the robot is extremely novel. And I'll present results of this pilot, and I'll go into detail about the careful consideration of the actual complex technology development leading up to this clinical trial. And then third, we collected some really promising preliminary data. There's a lot of exciting possibilities in the realm of robotics and cognitive training. So what were our research questions? Well, first, is SAR-led cognitive training feasible in facilitating improvements in cognitive training? We wanted to investigate the facilitators and barriers influencing user adoption. And we also wanted to consider the social and functional design features of the robot that might contribute to user attitudes. So the design of the robot was a huge focus in this early study. So let me start with a robot design. For this study, we used a robot created by Van Robotics. We named the robot Mari, and like every good academic, we feel the need to have a really good acronym, right? So Mari stands for Musical Assistive Robot Instructor. And because this pilot study investigated feasibility, we created what's called a Wizard of Oz interface to control the robot. So Wizard of Oz interface essentially refers to the fact that a remote operator could control the robot and control its utterances. So you can see the Wizard of Oz user interface here on the right. The dashboard was used to calibrate and set up the robot, as well as control the robot utterances related to the piano lesson content. You can see buttons for each of the lesson content, each component. And that launched the robot to introduce a learning concept and then provide playing instructions. On the left, you can see a list of feedback utterances. We know that when we're training and teaching folks, that constant feedback from the instructor is incredibly important. So these utterances included positive reinforcement and encouragement. The operator would choose the appropriate feedback depending on the older adult's progression through the lesson. So we often use a Wizard of Oz approach just to get the design right the first time around, right? We don't want to put a lot of development effort into creating an autonomous robot unless we know from this feasibility study that we're headed in the right direction. So that's why this Wizard of Oz is a common methodology used in human-robot interaction. So here's the experimental setup. The operator controlled the robot through the Wizard of Oz setup using computer 1. The participant sat at computer 2. And here the participant sat in front of an 88-key keyboard, weighted keys, and the computer screen displayed the lesson content. I'll show you that in a minute. For this pilot study, we used commercially available lessons called Scoof. The robot was situated next to the screen where it could read aloud instructions, give feedback, give tips, and it could also gesture to the screen and the keyboard. So we carefully designed the Wizard of Oz interaction so that Mari was an encouraging instructor. We know from a lot of previous work that feedback is important, and during the 1 month long study, there were 4 lessons. The robot would start with the learning concepts and then give constant feedback as to how they were doing. The participants had no music experience prior to the study, and we focused on a number of learning concepts, learning notes, rhythm, playing with 1 hand, and then eventually playing with 2 hands. So the feedback the robot provided, as I mentioned, was really important. So it was always positive and encouraging, even when the participant was making mistakes. We worded the feedback in such a way to reduce feelings of stress. For example, one utterance example was Mari saying, "I know this can be hard, but you're doing a good job." Again, it was a Wizard of Oz study, so there was a human operator in the loop at all times. Although the participants were aware that the robot was remotely operated, they were still inclined to talk to the robot and ask it questions. So for the most part, we anticipated many of these kind of question-answer pairs. However, if the participant asked something the robot was not prepared to address, there was a button where the robot would then refer to the researcher. So in this pilot study, participants visited the lab for 4 weeks, and the procedure summary is provided here. In visit 1, we assessed cognitive function and music aptitude. The robot then led the piano lessons, which were about 30 minutes long. We then measured stress, workload, the robot social attributes, and technology acceptance. And the same lesson format was used for all 4 weeks. Participants were also required to engage at-home practice. So we equipped them with an 88-key keyboard in their home, and Mari assigned them homework assignments that they took home with them. In visit 4, participants completed the piano lesson and the HRI measures, and then they completed the cognitive measures again. So that way we could have pre-post cognition data. All right, so let's look at some preliminary results. We recruited 11 older adults with MCI. The sample is mostly female, overwhelmingly white and Caucasian. That's something we will work on to improve in our upcoming clinical trial. Please note that while they had mixed experience with music, such as singing or dancing, none of the older adults had previous experience playing the piano, and none of them knew how to read music. In this pilot study, I mentioned that, that there were cognitive assessments taken at visit 1 and visit 4. So let's start with those data. So we collected a lot of cognition and health data. This is just a snippet. And this table depicts the cognitive measures only. So let me orient you to this graph before we dig into the numbers in detail. So at the top of the chart, you can see average TICs and MMSE scores. And this indicates that on average, our participants were categorized as having mild cognitive impairment. You can see that in the top 2 lines. The domain-specific cognitive testing was collected at visit 1 and visit 4 using CNS vital signs. CNS vital signs is a computerized neurocognitive and behavioral assessment tool. So it's a lot of data. So let me highlight a few specific cognitive domains where we saw some really interesting results. So essentially, reading the table from left to right, you can see here the results of the CNS that are domain specific. And you can see the percent change in functioning across the intervention, again, comparing visit 1 and visit 4. In the right-hand column, you'll find the p-value to determine significant differences less than 0.05. So briefly, the participants experienced improved cognitive function in multiple domains by the end of the intervention period. This was only in 4 weeks. So cognitive function improved in the computed neurocognitive index score, as well as verbal memory, executive function, reaction time, and cognitive flexibility. So this data is highly encouraging considering the short length of the pilot study. There are no significant differences in composite memory, visual memory, processing speed, reasoning, or psychomotor speed. All right, so let's look next at measures of stress and workload. And these data were collected at every single visit. So we use the perceived stress scale, and it's administered to measure users' self-reported stress. And you can see here that there's baseline, so we asked them when they arrived, how stressed they were during the piano lesson. Then we also had an active listening task as part of the piano lesson where the robot would play a piece of music and the older adult was asked to listen and reflect on the piece. That's commonly used in music-based cognitive training. So you can see here that participants reported the active listening and the piano tasks as more stressful than baseline. You can see all 4 visits are represented by different colors. And let's see here, I'm gonna make sure I don't miss anything. The piano task, which you can see there in the middle, was perceived as more stressful than the active listening, and they reported moderate stress, which is actually really ideal for learning tasks. The level of stress experienced during the piano lesson did increase with lesson difficulty, and you can see a significant difference in perceived stress between the first visit and then the 4th visit in the piano lesson. We also assessed workload. This is a lot of data, so I'll walk you through it, but we administered the NASA TLX. It's a measure that's commonly used in human factors research, where we measure workload across several different domains, including mental demand, physical demand, temporal demand, effort, frustration, performance. So what I'm gonna ask you to do is primarily look at the data that's highlighted in orange. That is the piano lessons. The higher the score, in general, the more workload that participant experienced. So the findings show that participants perceived the piano tasks to be moderately to highly demanding, but yet they felt successful in performing the task, which you can actually see in the lower right-hand graph. The music listening task scores, which are shown in gray, did not differ from baseline in terms of experiences of workload, and those are shown in blue. So you might be wondering what happened in visit 3, right? You see a spike in workload. And during that particular lesson, the robot guided the participants from playing with one hand, the right hand, to playing with 2, so increase in workload. In our study sample, there were trends for a relation in cognitive functional status and workload. Again, trends approaching significance. So for example, participants with higher psychomotor speed tended to report feeling less temporal demand. So in other words, they felt less time pressure. Participants with higher executive functioning and better cognitive flexibility also tended to report feeling less temporal demand, as well as less physical demand. So these are definitely things we want to keep an eye on in our clinical trial. It also points to possible individual differences, which I'll get to more in a little bit. So looking at the procedure again, we collected various measures related to participants' social interactions with the robot, and I have a handful of results to show you. So first is the Robotic Social Attribute Scale, also known as ROSAS. It's shown here on the left. And this is the commonly used 18-item human-robot interaction tool. It was adapted from the Godspeed scale, which is used in the psychological literature for social perception. And this essentially measures users' perceptions of the robot's social attributes. And there are 3 scale dimensions: competence, discomfort, and warmth. So this was measured at every single lesson. And you can see that participants rated the robot's competence as very high, even though they knew it was remotely operated. And that's indicated by the red line. Their perceptions of robot competence increased as the lessons became more difficult. So they thought that Mari was a competent piano instructor. Discomfort, which is shown in purple, is low across all 4 weeks. That's great. And then finally, warmth is depicted in gray. And you can see that the participants rated the robot's warmth as moderate, right, across all 4 weeks. And this was interesting. It's interesting to consider from a human-robot interaction standpoint, what is the role of the robot? We were careful to construct the utterances in such a way where the robot's role as the instructor was very clear. We might have sacrificed some user perceptions of robot warmth and approachability in that design choice. So we think there's some room for improvement here to strike the right balance between the robot's role as a serious instructor, but also promoting social engagement. On the right here, we have some data showing descriptors that the participants used when we asked them in a survey to define the role of the robot. And in this survey, you can see most participants thought of the robot as a teacher, and this complements the ROSAS data. Lastly, you might be wondering if the older adults actually learned to play the piano. Did they learn a lot from this? Now, the study was not long enough for us to find pre-post differences, and there are advanced measures of music audiation. That's a test that's commonly used to assess this. Nor was it long enough to really assess differences in learning the piano content over time. However, I can say that in a 1-month period, the robot-led lessons taught older adults with no prior music experience to play simple 2-handed songs. Mary Had a Little Lamb and Twinkle Twinkle Little Star were very popular. So the older adults expressed that they felt like they learned a lot, and 10 out of 11 older adults said that they would use the robot regularly if they were given the opportunity to. All right, so what does all this mean? Well, we know that by the end of the intervention period, participants improved in a number of cognitive domains, which is consistent with past work from our laboratory as well as others. Thus, socially assistive robots may improve cognitive function. I want to stress again that although we found significant improvement in some cognitive domains, we are very careful to say that it might or it may improve cognitive function. We cannot yet confirm this. In order to say definitively that robots can improve cognitive function, a longer intervention period is needed. A longer intervention will help confirm that these improvements are attributable to solely the robot above and beyond practice effects from cognitive testing. So consider this, in the 4-week period, in week 1, they conducted the cognitive battery. In week 4, they conducted the same cognitive battery. There might be some learning effects due to that short time period in between the 2 tests that are exactly the same. So we need to determine whether or not these effects are also long-lasting. Previous piano learning cognitive training protocols suggest that substantial improvements can be found with longer cognitive training duration. About 6 months is typically what you see in the literature. So additional testing from our laboratory and others using longer protocols and appropriate controls would determine whether or not additional training time yields such improvement. We also need a longer testing period to see any differences in changes in musical aptitude. So through this pilot study, we have a number of lessons learned that we are implementing into our upcoming clinical trial. So first is it's just the fact that creating this sort of really complex human-robot interaction, it's really difficult. Piano learning requires executing complex and novel movements, engaging working memory, identifying matches and mismatches in pitch and rhythm, maintaining sustained attention, identifying the mood or tone of the piece. There's a lot going on here and a lot that we're expecting of this robot, right? Each of these cognitively taxing tasks are usually guided by a human instructor who not only teaches and demonstrates mechanics, but also coaches and guides the learning experience. So the fact that participants expressed the feeling that Mari was a competent teacher, and the fact that they showed some trends in improved cognitive functioning, this is really, really promising, particularly considering it was a Wizard of Oz methodology, right? So it's promising that when asked if they would use the robot, 10 out of 11 older adults said yes. So we're nearly ready to start our 6-month clinical trial, again, COVID. So some things that we want to improve upon regarding the design of the robot. So in this pilot study, we did test out a few objective measures, including an attention tracker and a thermal sensor. This data was not very conclusive from a behavioral standpoint. In part, we were implementing it in this phase 1 just to kind of test out the capability of these sensors. And these sensors are being further developed for our phase 2 development, including using it with a mask, which is just coming through a wrench and everything. And it's important to ensure that the participant is sustaining attention throughout the lesson, and that the thermal tracker will actually detect changes in the participant's stress level. I mentioned earlier that some of our preliminary data suggests that stress and workload might differ a bit across participants depending on their cognitive function. So it's important that we design this next iteration of the robot, which will be fully autonomous and have artificial intelligence, that the robot is reactive to the person's capability. We're also carefully assessing some qualitative interview data. I didn't have that ready to share today, but we did interview the participants to understand their perceptions of the robot personality and their perceptions of the interaction. We want to make sure that this robot is socially engaging. So we're adding in opportunities for the robot to be funny. The next version, it will tell some jokes, it will express more joy in its instruction, and we think that will go a long way. Along the same thread, one thing that happened actually quite often during or I shouldn't say quite often, it occasionally happened during the phase 1 data collection, was that participants unexpectedly would say something to the robot or ask a question that we weren't quite prepared for. And I actually have a funny example. One participant arrived at the session and she saw Mari and she wanted to compliment the robot. And she said, "Mari, you have beautiful eyes." To which the operator, who was a poor graduate student, panicked a little bit because we didn't have a button on the Wizard of Oz interface for the robot to say thank you. I don't know why we didn't think of it, but anyway, so this poor graduate student is like, oh, what should the robot say? So to the compliment, "Mari, you have beautiful eyes," the robot simply replied, "Yes." It's a very confident robot. So joking aside, the interaction could benefit from some future research in natural language processing and having more dynamic conversational exchange. As I've highlighted before, multimodal tasks are ideal for cognitive training, right? So we used off-the-shelf, commercially available online lessons for this pilot study. But for the clinical trial that is upcoming, we actually have created custom lesson content. And this includes a really awesome collaboration between us, neuroscience, as well as folks in the music school. And this includes both piano playing and music listening. So we are creating custom content that will be ideal for cognitive training with learning concepts of notation, rhythm, theory, technique, and dynamics. So this is going to be a much more in-depth lesson. It's also much more dynamic because of individual differences. As you all know, no two people with dementia are the same. In the phase 2 clinical trial, they can progress through the lessons at their own pace. They can go forward, they can go backward, right? So there are days that a person with dementia might not be, quite feeling up to the task, in which case we can repeat lesson content. So it'll be much more dynamic depending on the person's performance. And as I mentioned, this is the next version of this. The robot will be fully autonomous. This is a big deal. And the robot will progress through the lessons with no remote operator. And the robot will be tracking performance along the way. We will have an operator like creepily watching behind a glass wall, but the robot will be leading the entire interaction. And then it's important for the lesson progression to be tailored. As I mentioned earlier, individual differences really, really matter here. They have good days, they have bad days. The robot needs to adjust. And I mentioned those sensors earlier. The attention and stress tracking will play a huge role in development of that artificial intelligence. In our clinical trial, we'll have a much larger sample size, so we'll be able to actually parse this out as well as a control condition. So to wrap up, cognitive training is complex, and designing human-robot interaction to support long-lasting, effective improvements, it's no easy feat, but it certainly is a really fun endeavor, and we're excited about the potential that this project has. The feeling that participants expressed that Mari was competent is super encouraging, and our cognitive function data is also incredibly promising. So our next steps are underway. I should note that this grant is funded by NIH STTR Fast Track Grant. So by the end of the funding period, our collaborator, Van Robotics, will actually have a commercialized and affordable product. The goal is to retail it for around $300, far less than the cost of piano lessons. So I'd like to acknowledge the interdisciplinary team one more time, as well as NIH for funding this. And I am again thrilled to be here to present to you all and share this exciting new project. And thank you for listening. And I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Beer. We have a couple of questions, 2 questions in the Q&A and 1 question in the chat box. So can you see those questions, or do you want me to read those questions for you?
Give me a second. I can pull them up if that's easier. Let me pull this over here. All right, thank you. I'm seeing a number of different questions. Okay, so the first one is about ethical issues. Yes. Yes. That is definitely something to consider, and something that we talk a lot about in our laboratory. And when I think about technology issues, particularly ethical issues of using technology, it's kind of a layered approach. So my first response, typically that we talk about in the lab, is that it's not the answer for everybody. There's some older adults who are going to go, nope, and that is okay. Right? And it's important to understand non-adoption as much as it is to understand adoption of technology and what's driving that decision making. And often ethics has a big part of it. One particular ethical consideration that's come up across all of my research in the past decade is privacy. So when you're using these technologies, what's going on with the data? So there's a lot of interesting research in this arena, and some of the best recommendations or best user-centered recommendations are to think about privacy issues from the standpoint of the end user. What do they need to know in order to make an informed decision as to whether or not ethically to adopt this technology or not? And there are 2 things, control and transparency, that help address that. So if the user has control over the data that's being collected, that improves privacy and reduces ethical issues considerably. So what's happening to that data? Who is it being shared with, right? And the other is transparency. So if that data is being shared, which we all know, say from social media and so on, it's often unavoidable, it should be incredibly clear to the end user what's being done with that data, who's accessing it, so on. That transparency is incredibly important. So hopefully that answers part of your question. Let's see, next one. I'm concerned that equity, diversity, and inclusion is not addressed in this area, even beyond costs. How have you incorporated a plan to incorporate DEI in your research, design, development, and testing? Brilliant question. Thank you, Daniel. Yes, the Cognitive Aging Research and Education Center, we are housed, we're a mix of public health and social work. So this has been a topic we've discussed a lot lately. And one initiative that we have really focused on regarding DEI is expanding our clinical trials to include individuals in rural Georgia. So that includes, folks of diverse racial and ethnic background, but also socioeconomic status, right? In rural Georgia, especially, it's difficult to access technology, and we're painfully aware of that. So we just submitted a grant at R24, fingers crossed we get it, that would expand our capability to reach out to rural Georgia and reach these folks. The University of Georgia has, it's a land grant university, so we have extension offices in every single county in Georgia. And so we're actually in the process through this grant that we just applied for, but also whether we get it or not, we're in the process of collaborating with Extension to essentially recruit folks from rural areas, increase our DEI. COVID, a silver lining of COVID is that a lot of our research has moved to virtual. So for those folks who do have Wi-Fi, they could access a lot of these studies virtually, including clinical trials. And then with the extension offices, we're hoping that those who do not have Wi-Fi could actually go to an extension office and then access our studies through that particular UGA office that's located in their local county. So that's one initiative that we have that we're really excited about. And frankly, we need to do better. The last time I looked at aging clinical trials, we did an assessment, and less than 1% included rural older adults who are incredibly diverse. So thank you for that question, and definitely something we're struggling with and trying to figure out a better way to reach that population. And then another person here asked for clarification on the education characteristics of the participants and the socioeconomic status. So that I think relates to the DEI question. This particular sample was not as diverse as we would have liked. It was a bit of a convenience sample. So our participants were primarily white, educated, and were a bit more affluent. So something we are addressing for our clinical trial.
Thank you, Dr. Beer. We have 2 more questions in the chat box. Do you want me to read that for you?
Sure, it might be faster because I'm trying to find the chat. Yeah, if you have it handy.
What do you think the advantages of using a robot over using an on-screen animated avatar or a smart speaker like Alexa?
Oh,
it's from Michael. Yep.
Thank you, Michael. Great question. Yeah, so there's a number of research labs out there who are doing an excellent job looking at this particular question. It's complex. So the advantages of a robot versus like a virtual agent are actually pretty strong. Robots have a physical presence, right? And we call that embodiment. So the robot is more likely to be viewed by end users of all ages as kind of having its own social entity rather than a virtual agent, which is perceived more as like a software program. So we see some pretty significant differences between using a robot and a virtual agent in terms of applying social attributes to that technology, which is really interesting. So for applications such as cognitive training, where that social interaction is so important, we think that robot will drive that social engagement much more so than anything on screen. So in our upcoming clinical trial, we actually will have 3 conditions. We have a true control where individuals won't have any music exposure at all. We'll have a condition where they'll receive the lessons on the screen, but no robot. And then we'll have a condition where we have the lessons plus the robot. So that way we'll be able to tease apart that very research question you brought up. While it's not a virtual agent, we are at least comparing the on-screen content versus the content plus the robot. So we'll kind of get at it. Great question.
There's one more question from Ellen Baski, and they're asking if are the social robots capable of doing any screening regarding elder abuse and neglect? If so, how would they report these types of concerns?
Ooh, stumped. I don't know. I can't think of any literature in this area. I might be mistaken. There might be some stuff out there, but I can't think of anything. And boy, that sounds like a really interesting dissertation question to ask. I would just anecdotally and just, from my experience in the field, I would say, gosh, that's a slippery slope. It's really interesting to think about whether or not robots could assist with that sort of reporting, particularly if for whatever reason we find that older adults might be more willing to share experiences or whatever with robots. But, in terms of ethical applications, we'd also really need to make sure that the robot is accurate in its reporting, that it's timely. I can imagine a lot of legal things to consider in that design. So really fascinating that, yeah, I wish I had a better answer, but that's a really interesting question.
There's one last question from Helen. Would you like to answer that? It's in the question and answer
Sure.
box.
Give me a second to scroll. So let's see here. Through your research, have you noticed any possible linkages between environmental toxins and higher numbers of dementia diagnosis? Great question. I haven't investigated that in my own research per se, but that's an excellent question. And I do know that there's a body of literature out there that suggests that there is a link between environmental toxins and Alzheimer's diagnosis, or at least certainly signs of cognitive decline, right? So I can't speak to it much beyond that, other than I do know there's a link, but I have not investigated that from a technology perspective. Great question, though.
I think that concludes our questions, and I know that we're out of time and people will have to leave. I want to thank you coming for Janae. It's a great presentation, very interesting, and I think we're going to be looking at your future work, and we'll want to circle back to you, but it's a very fascinating topic, and thanks for doing a great job, and thanks to all of you for coming, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks again.